Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. Today, we're going to be talking about a really cool subject, a subject that I love very much. What is the genetic code? And some of you might remember that tomorrow at 5 o'clock Pacific time, I will be doing a debate about this because there is some confusion as to whether or not the genetic code really is a code or if it's just sort of like a code. And that's why scientists call it the genetic code. The genetic code is, in fact, a code. We'll go over a little bit of that today. But tomorrow night, you'll see me debate on this topic for, I don't know, probably an hour and a half or so. So that'll be really cool. So 5 o'clock Pacific time on the Non Sequitur YouTube channel. And if you follow me on Twitter, that's at Stated Clearly. I'll be posting about it on there. So you'll have a link. You'll be able to sign up and watch it live. You'll be able to, add questions as we go, and it'll be a lot of fun. I'm very excited to do that debate. But today, let's just dig in here and kind of learn about the nuts and bolts of the genetic code. Share my screen. Says that they don't think calling it a code is appropriate. It's more of an algorithm. That's by Immutable Destiny. Sorry, buddy, you're wrong. We call it a code because it is a genetic code, according to the definition of code used in communication theory, which is what gave rise to the digital revolution. And we'll learn about that here today. So a little bit about that here today. Gonna hide. So this here on my screen is the cipher for the genetic code. So you've probably seen that if you took a biology course in college or high school. Here are examples of other types of code. So I guess before we ask what the genetic code is, we should ask what the heck a code is in general. So here on the left, we've got binary code, the ASCII code. So we see that, when you type an A on your keyboard, that is turned into a series of ones and zeros. And all the different letters of the alphabet have their own set of ones and zeros. And actually what's happening here is that a 1 is an electric pulse and a 0 is null. So when you hit the A on your keyboard, it sends a series of pulses and null vacant spots. And your computer reads that out as an A. Here in the middle, we have the International Morse code. And that's a series of dots and dashes, and that's for transmitting words across a wire. You can also use Morse code with light. You can just use a flashlight and flash Morse code at someone, and if they know Morse code, they can actually write down what it is that you're trying to say to them. They can read your message. And then on the right here, we have a really horribly truncated cipher for English. So we've got these words and what they mean. English is a really special type of code that linguists study. They call it English is one of many natural languages, but all of these things are codes. English just being a special type of code, but all of these are codes. The binary code allows your keyboard to communicate with your computer. It also allows all sorts of parts of your computer to communicate with other parts of your computer. Morse code allows people to transmit information across a wire or with light, and English allows you to transfer information from your brain through the air to the ear of someone else, and they will then decode that back into a thought. So you start with a thought, you're thinking about an apple, you encode that thought into movements of your mouth, and you broadcast that, you transmit it through the air. It is then decoded by the ear and brain of the receiver, and they get that same image in their brain that you had. So code, the purpose of code is to transmit information from one entity to another entity. That's what code does. You can also use code to hide information, but still you're transmitting information from one entity to another. If you're encrypting a message, for example, you are hiding it from people that might want to try to intercept it, but it's the same thing. You're just broadcasting information from one entity to another entity, and it could be between two people, as in with spoken English. It could be between two machines, as in your keyboard and a computer. Doesn't matter. A code, here is the definition of code in communication theory. This is derived from Claude Shannon's work. A code is a set of rules governing a communication system. So that might not make a whole lot of sense if you don't have a clear idea what a communication system is, but that's okay because we're gonna talk about that here in a second. So this is the super famous paper by Claude Shannon. This version of it's 1948. That's when he published this. Communication theory and kind of theory describing what codes do. People started really working on this in the 20s. We'd already been using codes forever. I mean, English is a code. Spoken words are codes. But we'd been actively creating codes for a long time. Morse code was a code, again, that was invented to transmit information across a wire. That was the first reason that it was invented. Some people think that Morse code is for transmitting information in secret. That's not the case. It was for transmitting information across a wire. And again, or through light. You can use a flashlight, your headlights, to communicate Morse code. So people have been using codes for a long time. And Claude Shannon, he worked for Bell Labs. So he's working at the telephone company. And he and other people that he worked with were creating different ways to transmit information through a telephone wire. And they're working on different codes, different coding systems to take audio, stuff that people are saying, turn that into things that are easier to transmit across the wire without losing data. If you're talking through a really long wire, you know, the microphone converts your speech into electric pulses. Those electric pulses transfer through a wire, and then the speaker transforms that back into sound vibrations. Well, if you have a really long wire, noise gets added to that. And so they were trying to find different ways to encode that information and transmit it over a long, long wire without having any loss, without having any noise disrupting the system. And, you know, he had all sorts of examples of code at this time. There were examples of, you know, things like Morse code and so on. Computers weren't really a thing at this time. But he created this paper describing what a communication system is, just a mathematical theory of communication. And this paper is credited for enabling the entire digital revolution. I mean, once he articulated so well what communication is, what code is in this paper, that people were able to figure out all sorts of weird new ways to invent communication systems and invent machines that communicate with other machines and so on. And he is credited for being responsible for this digital revolution that we're all enjoying today. Absolutely amazing, his work. Now, so what is a communication system? This comes from Shannon's paper here. This is kind of confusing to look at if you're not used to it, but there's an information source. So let's just think about English for a minute here, because all of us are extremely familiar with English. Actually, I've talked to some people about this and they get a little bit confused with English. Maybe we should do Morse code. The reason sometimes people get confused with English is that if you don't speak a foreign language, English is so natural to you that it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like a code. But so maybe we'll use Morse code here. So you have it with Morse code. You have an information source. So usually someone's looking at a piece of paper with a note on it, some text, and then they have a transmitter. And actually, so the person and the machine that they're working on to transmit the written message, you can kind of think of the person and that machine together as one transmitter. And so, back in the day, the the guy or gal working at the Morse code transmission center, they had the Morse code all memorized. Again, here's that Morse code here in the middle here. The dots and dashes, they represent different letters. So da, 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 and they would, hit the little beeper and transmit that information. That would go out through a wire. And so this here in the middle, where we say we have signal and receive signal, that represents the wire that the signal is being transmitted through. Again, if you're just speaking to someone in a room, you're actually transmitting sound vibrations through the air. So Claude Shannon describes this as the channel that you're communicating through. The air is a channel you can communicate through. A wire is a channel you can communicate through with Morse code. And then there is a receiver. And the receiver in the early days of Morse code was another person at a machine listening to it. And then they would write down the message. They've got the Morse code memorized, and the destination is that final message. And, that final message can be delivered to whoever it is that that message was intended for. So this is how a communication system works. It's the same for English. It's the same for Morse code. It's the same for your computer, your keyboard talking to your monitor through the computer. This is a communication system. And when we had really nailed this down, like really had a good solid theory for this, bam, we could figure out how to do amazing things technologically. So here are some examples. This is kind of like this chart here is kind of messy, maybe overbuilt, you could say. So I've kind of redone it here. Here's some examples of communication systems. The top example here is just an abstract example. You need an encoder, you need a message, you need a decoder, and then you'll have the decoded message. So code, the set of rules that govern the communication system, dictates how the message will be written. So this the second example here, sorry, just burped into the microphone. The second example here is a keyboard, and then the 1 0 0 0 0 0 1. So that's the binary code. That's the message, and it's being encoded according to the rules of the coding language. In this case, it's ASCII binary code. That is transmitted through the wire to the computer screen, and then the computer screen displays the A. So the computer decodes that message into an A on the monitor. Below that, I've got me, and I have a message, which is the plans for a house. And I've used the rules of the blueprinting code. There is a set of rules that are established for how to draw blueprints. And if you know those rules, you can create blueprints. And a contractor will understand those blueprints. So I transmit my idea for this house to a contractor, and then the contractor decodes that message into a house. That's the final product. And then at the bottom here, I have a little foreshadowing for the genetic code. You've got DNA. A message is encoded in message RNA, mRNA, that is sent to the ribosome in the cell. And again, we'll learn what all this means later here, just real quickly. And then that is decoded by the ribosome into a protein. So the protein in the genetic code system is the final product, the decoded message. So before I continue and talk about the genetic code and how cells use it, let's do some Q&A here. Uh, is there anything about what I just presented that was unclear? It's going to take me a second here. I got to read through questions. As you all know, I'm not particularly good at this. If you do stated clearly, it'll help me find your question faster. Someone said, Immutable Destiny says, isn't the genetic code not entirely universal? Correct. It is not entirely universal. Different organisms use slightly different versions of it. And the same is true for binary code. You know, the ASCII code is, what does that stand for? American Standard something, something, something. There are multiple types of codes. Codes are sort of arbitrary. Not completely arbitrary. The sender and the receiver have to agree on what how the code should be used in order for communication to happen properly. If there's not agreement, then communication will fail or partly fail. So let's just go back to these examples of a code. I got English as one of the codes here. Obviously, some people speak Japanese. Some people speak Spanish instead of English. And those are examples of, different versions of code, but it's code for communicating the same types of things. You can say all of these things. You can say apple, cry, horse, shoes, plane. You can say all that in Japanese. You can say that in Spanish. So there are several different languages, you could say, used by different organisms, but the genetic code, the basics of the genetic code are the same. I mean, the genetic code is used to communicate the same types of things in all organisms. And there's actually very little differences between how the genetic code is used in different organisms. It's probably better to say that if you want to compare it to English, it's more like different dialects of English, like different accents of English than it is completely different languages, because all organisms we've studied so far have very, very similar genetic codes that they use. Is it possible for arsenic to be used in place of phosphate in nucleotides, which could possibly code for other traits or genes or something? SJ. I don't know anything about that. I think there are people experimenting with invented genetic codes, artificial genetic codes, to add more amino acids, but I might talk about that more in a little bit. Someone says, Richard Wood says, there are global standards groups for interoperability at every level, so it seems. The same is actually true in biology, but the standards are evolved, so that's the big difference. One of the reasons that the genetic code is so universal is that we all share a common ancestor, and that common ancestor just had one genetic code. And as we're going to learn here, when we really look at how the genetic code works, we're going to see that if you tweak it, if you actually modify the code, so the rules that govern how cells create proteins, it's going to break pretty much every single gene in that organism. So tweaks to the genetic code are extremely toxic, you could say. Whenever a mutation changes the genetic code, and a single mutation can change the genetic code, but whenever that happens, it kills the organism that inherits that, almost always. And the few changes that we do see between organisms are so tiny because of that. That it was well established in our common ancestor already, which brings questions to, how did the genetic code first get started? And that's actually something that's an active question, not completely solved, in life origins chemistry, but we do have some ideas as to how this happened. I'm not going to talk about that too much today. It's a topic for another time, but the origin of the genetic code is a really fascinating question. Again, not solved by any means. It's not solved in a way that everyone's satisfied, but we do have theory explaining the types of things that would have happened to give rise to the genetic code. Actually, let me talk about that for a minute here, because, well, let me see if there's any other questions. Is it possible to change one creature's genetic information to another creature's code? And what will happen? Maybe silly question, but let's say at least it is possible for close related species. So again, when we're talking about code versus genetic information, those are two different things. The code is the set of rules that govern the communication system. The genome is the genetic information. So I have a whole bunch of different genes that code for my traits. And the genetic code is a set of rules that's used to govern that, how those genes are read, essentially. So what I think you're actually asking there is it possible to change one creature's genetic information to another creature's genetic information? What will happen? I actually have a video on that here on this YouTube channel. I think it's like, what would happen if I changed my DNA with a cat's DNA? Long story short, you would die because you'd start making proteins that are foreign, and your immune system would kill the cells that are doing that. And if you were to somehow swap out all of your DNA and every one of your cells with a cat's DNA, or even just a chimp's DNA, your immune system would kill you immediately. Well, it might take a while, but pretty close to immediately. Jay asks, is it possible for there to be ribosomes that chain together other amino acids instead of the ones identified in the codon chart? Yes, people do that. Experimentally, people do that. Would it be, Immutable Destiny asks, would it be feasible for other similar nitrogenous bases to be used as a suitable substitute for the current DNA nucleotides we use? Yes. There are actually several artificial gene molecules, one of which was invented here in Corvallis, where I live. They're called oncomorpholinos, and they're really cool. We don't actually use them. They're not actually read by the ribosome. They're actually used to block genes. They bind with genes. But yeah, you could build any system you want, really. You just need a decoder that can read the message properly. So you'd have to tweak with the ribosome a little bit to get it to use things like morpholinos. I'm actually not sure how much you'd have to tweak the ribosome to get it to use these artificial nucleotides, but yeah, you can use other things. And people that are studying the origin of life are very much aware of this. And there's actually some good reason to believe that the very first gene-like molecules were not RNA and were not DNA. So it's interesting. I think that kind of seems like it does it for questions. If that doesn't, make sure to do @statedclearly or @statedcasually here, and I will see your question. But I just want to talk really quick about how codes evolve. Just really quick. I wasn't really planning on doing this, but so communication systems are everywhere in biology. So the genetic code is just one of many. It's kind of like at the basement of communication systems in biology. Your cells communicate with each other. They do this through sending out hormones. Well, it's called hormones when it's one tissue to another tissue. Um, Bacteria communicate with each other. They send out molecules, communication molecules with each other, and they coordinate their behaviors with one another. This usually happens, that like true communication usually only happens between closely related species of bacteria, but there's actually uh, quite a bit of signaling that happens cross species in bacteria as well. It turns out that anytime symbiosis evolves, a communication system also evolves by default. It's just part of symbiosis. And when I'm saying symbiosis here, I mean mutualistic symbiosis. There's also parasitic symbiosis and so on and so forth. But in mutualistic symbiosis, when two organisms evolve to cooperate with one another, inevitably, it's by definition, a communication system evolves between them. And this we're used to thinking of communication as something that happens between two entities that can think and communicate with each other. So, like, it makes sense that dogs can communicate with each other, right? They communicate through barking. They also communicate through urine. And actually, they have a fairly sophisticated communication system based on smell and molecules in their urine. There's some really neat papers on the golden jackal talking about the communication system that male and female golden jackals use. The female, when she goes into heat, there's a molecule that she produces in her urine, which it would have started out as just a normal byproduct of going into heat. Her body's making different molecules because she's in heat. So that gets excreted in her urine, and other males ended up picking up on this, like, oh, there's a dog that's in heat over here. Let's go find her because it's time to mate. But not only does she excrete this accidentally, when we accidentally send out a signal, we actually don't call that a signal, we call it a cue. And we're constantly sending out millions of cues. When you walk around, you're sending out footsteps. Those are cues. If a predator is trying to hunt you, they can use those cues to find you. If an animal is scared of you, they can use those cues to run away. They can hear your footsteps. You're constantly emitting smells. You're constantly emitting all sorts of things. And if any other organism picks up on that, whether they use their brain to put two and two together, like footsteps equals John is coming, so let's get ready to kill him and eat him, or whether or not this evolves, as is the case in bacteria. Bacteria have evolved receptors to pick up on molecules in their surroundings, and they can actually tell what other bacteria are around them using these receptors. We're constantly emitting cues, and organisms around us, if it benefits them, if it helps their survival and reproduction to pick up on those cues, well, any mutation that allows them to pick up on those cues will be promoted by natural selection. Natural selection will promote that. So a communication system can develop between two things that can think, two entities that can think and learn. They can develop a communication system between each other. You and your dog. If you have a dog, you have developed a communication system between you and your dog. But also any two entities that can evolve through descent with a modification can also develop a communication system when selection is favoring cooperation. So about this female dog who she's going into heat, this golden jackal, she's going into heat. Not only does she accidentally excrete these molecules, but nowadays this communication system has been evolving for many thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. Nowadays, she will actively transmit that communication molecule. She will urinate in strategic areas that are likely to be smelled easier by males. She's going to advertise that she is ready to mate, and males will come. And when she finds a mate, they actually do this really funny kind of dance back and forth. Well, she will urinate. He will go urinate where she urinated. She'll go urinate on top of that again. And they're constantly smelling this urine and checking for molecules that signal health in the other animal, signal strength in the other animal. And if they like each other, they'll mate. And once they mate, if the male really likes this female and actually wants to, raise a family with her, he will follow her everywhere. And every time she urinates, because she's still going to be in heat for a while, every time she urinates, he will urinate on top of that. And that tells other males, whoa, there is a female in heat, but she's taken. It's kind of the equivalent of putting a ring on it, for the golden jackal. And so this is a really cool communication system that is evolved in the golden jackal to communicate these messages to each other, and that actually stops fights from happening. If males that are looking for a female realize, oh, this one's taken, I could go for it anyway, but I'm gonna have to fight probably the male and the female. And the other thing that is suspected, though I don't know if this is confirmed, but if the female doesn't really like her mate that much, she will sneak off and try to urinate with him not noticing. So the male is very, very vigorous. The paper I read that was talking about this says that the golden jackal, the male golden jackal, will be so vigorous about this that he'll actually a lot of times pee on her while she's peeing, because he's trying to make sure that he does not miss a single time, because he could have to fight. And when an intruding male finds that sometimes when she urinates, the male urinates too, but sometimes not, what that tells him is that, I could sneak in here and I might have to fight the male, but I won't have to fight the female. She's open to finding a new partner. So there's a complicated communication system going on here, and it's all molecular based. There's a bunch of different signals in this dog urine communication system. But dogs aren't the only critters that communicate. Again, bacteria can communicate, and they don't have brains. They're not, I would not consider them conscious entities. So when we think about communication, it's a little weird at first, but it's important to get away from this idea that only intelligent things can communicate. Plants that don't have brains communicate with each other through molecular signals transmitted through the roots. Bacteria communicate. Your cells communicate with each other. There is massive amounts of communication happening in all biological systems. It's everywhere. It's a hallmark of life. And the foundation of that is the communication that happens in the genome. So, okay. Let me see if there's any questions here. Someone says DNA on its own isn't a blueprint. It's a recipe. It depends on the embryo to interpret and suppress sections to produce the correct enzymes, proteins, and mRNA sequences. Alone DNA is useless. Yeah, communication system. A message alone is useless, right? Like if everybody dies, any book that's ever been written is going to be useless, right? But what you're talking about here is the genetic code. All the genetic code does, and we're going to talk about this here in a second, is it tells the ribosome how to build a protein. That's all it does. There's actually other communication systems on top of the genetic code that tell the cell how often to produce a particular protein. But so we'll talk about that here in a second. Someone asks, why do animals use proteins and not those RNA that folds on itself and can do complex functions? So what he's talking about here is ribozymes. We usually use protein enzymes to do most of our stuff in biology. He's asking, why don't we use ribozymes? Proteins are better. They can do a larger diversity of things, but we actually do use a lot of functional RNAs. There are a lot of ribozymes that are useful, that our bodies do use. So we actually use both. But today in biology, there are more proteins than there are ribozymes. That wasn't always the case. We suspect that early on there was only ribozymes. And today we use both, and proteins ended up being better, so we mostly use proteins. Okay, so I'm going to continue here. So what is the genetic code used for? The genetic code is used to build protein. That is specifically what it's used for. It is a communication system that has evolved between the genome, all of your set of genes that you have inside the nucleus of your cells, and the ribosome. And we're going to learn what the ribosome is here in a minute. So the genetic code is the rules for a communication system that is used between the genome and the ribosome. Those are the two entities that are communicating with each other, the genome and the ribosome. Oh, I got a super chat question here from 0132132. What code besides the genetic code incorporated absurd amounts of junk data? Are there analogous ones that we use? The genetic code does not have a lot of junk data. You're talking about a genome. So our genome has lots. Most of our genome does not use the genetic code. Most of our genome does not code for proteins. Only certain chunks of it. The genetic code is the set of rules that govern the production of protein. So again, it's really important to differentiate between the genetic code and the genome. The genome being all the DNA that you have in your cells. The genetic code being the rules that govern that communication system between the genome and the ribosome. Now, the genetic code does have redundancies, but we'll see here later that those are actually useful. And English also has redundancies. There's multiple ways to say hello, for example. You can say hi, hello, what's up? So there are redundancies in all sorts of codes. Okay, so continuing on here, for those they're like, dude, most of what you're saying is gibberish. This is a weird conversation we're having here. I've got a video called on my other channel, stated clearly, called "What is DNA and how does it work?" And that kind of goes over the basics of what I'm about to tell you. But I'm going to go a little bit more in depth right now. So hopefully you've already watched that. If not, hopefully you already know kind of how DNA codes for protein. That's what we're going to talk about here, how DNA codes for protein. So your functional bits are mostly protein. So here we have a blood cell, and inside the blood cell, I've got this big protein that we're zooming in on. It's called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that its function is to grab onto oxygen molecules when blood flows near the lungs, and then release those oxygen molecules later when blood flows near oxygen-starved tissue. And hemoglobin is a very complex protein. It does its job extremely well. Different organisms have slightly different versions of hemoglobin, but pretty much all vertebrates have it, from fish to birds to people. And there are all kinds of proteins. Your fingernails are made of structural proteins called keratin. You have in your digestive system, you have pepsin, which is a digestive protein. Pepsin breaks apart your food, and so on. So proteins are the things in our bodies that do interesting stuff. There's other molecules that are active as well. Yeah, we just had that. We just had someone talking about. Sorry, I just got distracted. Well, we got another super chat. Look up hemoglobin versus chlorophyll. I think he's chlorophyll. I believe is partly not a protein. It's a It's a molecule built by proteins, though. Sorry. I'm horrible at multitasking. I watch Nancy do her live videos, and she is amazing at it. I get so easily distracted. But okay, so proteins are chains of amino acids. This is important to note. A protein is just a string of amino acids. Amino acids are smaller molecules. They're building blocks of proteins. There are actually 20 different kinds of amino acids that we have in our body. And you can see this protein on the right here that I drew. You can see it's got this kind of tail hanging off. That's because it's not fully folded yet. A protein is a long string of amino acids, and those amino acids bend and fold and stick to themselves to form a three-dimensional structure. That is the protein. And according to the structure, different structures will have different functions. They'll end up doing different things inside the cell. So a protein's function is dictated by its form, and its form is dictated by the way that it folds. But it's actually, you can actually pull a protein apart. It's going to be a long string. You can actually straighten it out into a string. But it will bend and fold and stick to itself just through chemical reactions with itself. A lot of hydrogen bonding, sulfide bonding, and so on. And something that's very important to note is that amino acids, these building blocks, I've drawn them in these little cute little colorful cartoon images, but they are molecules. Here's a list of the 20 amino acids in our body. And on the right here is pictured aspartic acid in the space-filling atomic model. So this is showing you all the atoms that are in that molecule. The reds are oxygen, the blue is nitrogen, white is hydrogen, the black is carbon. So this is what that one amino acid looks like, the aspartic acid. But a lot of times, if you look at the genetic code, you're going to see letters representing these amino acids. So ASP is the thing that you'll see scientists use in their codes when they're writing about, in their code charts when they're writing about the genetic code. You'll see that they use ASP for aspartic acid, but that just represents this molecule right here. So ASP represents this molecule. So here we have codes on top of codes, because when you're looking at when you're looking at the genetic code, here is the genetic code right here, the key to the genetic code. You're looking at see down here in the bottom, we have ASP right here. That's for aspartic acid. So these little bits in our genes code for aspartic acid. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but so amino acids are molecules. Very important to recognize that. Just they're not letters; they're molecules. And that might sound silly that I'm focusing so hard on that, but people do get this confused, especially when they're first learning about genetics. Long story short, amino acids make up proteins. Proteins make up living cells. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs, and organs make up living creatures like you and I. There are, of course, other molecules in the body. A lot of those molecules, though, are built by proteins. So it's you could really think of ourselves as protein machines. So here we have the nucleus of the cell, and then you've got inside the nucleus. I just drew DNA as a big long squiggle inside there. DNA sometimes is bound up in chromosomes that are, those nice little packets that we're used to seeing when we look at a chromosome. But chromosomes also open up into kind of like a noodle-like structure. So I've got it kind of in noodle form there. There's also all kinds of protein in the nucleus, all sorts of molecules in there. But one of the things that's in there is DNA. So I've got this chain of DNA you can see here. And DNA is made of nucleotides. And there are 4 different kinds of nucleotides, which we'll label C, T, G, and A for cytosine, thymine, guanine, and adenine. Remembering those names is not important, but remembering that we label those with names and we label those with letters is important. But again, nucleotides are molecules. I got to reiterate this because people think that there's like letters in our DNA. You could say there's letters in our DNA, but those are just symbols for these specific molecules. So here on the left, I've got a space-filling model of DNA. So you can see all the atoms in a DNA molecule there. And then I've got my cartoon version of DNA, which is labeled with A's and T's and C's and G's on it. And then here, my nucleotides, I've got them labeled. And here we see what guanine looks like. This is actually guanine plus its sugar backbone, and it's phosphorus. So guanine is right here. That's what it looks like. So when we say G, the genetic letter G, we actually mean this molecule right here, this big, crazy looking molecule. And this, just so you can map this on visually to this DNA molecule on the left here, this little red and orange part here at the bottom is the backbone. It's the backbone of the molecule. And this here is what we call the base, and it's actually in the middle here. So a DNA molecule is two chains linked together in the middle and forming this spiraling ladder. Pretty cool. And then they're linked covalently along the backbone. So what happens inside your cell is that there is another communication system that we're not going to talk about here that takes stretches of DNA that we call genes, and a whole collection of molecules that are in charge of deciding, you could say, which parts of the genome are going to be transcribed into RNA. So this DNA, little stretches of DNA, are copied into RNA. RNA is a molecule that's very similar to DNA, slightly different. It's ribonucleic acid. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. So DNA's got some oxygen taken off of it. And then there's also a different nucleotide. Instead of T, instead of thymine in RNA, we replace that with U, which is uracil. Almost forgot that. So that's the differences between DNA and RNA. They're pretty much the same, but slight differences. And RNA is usually found in single-stranded single-stranded chains instead of double-stranded chains like we see in DNA. See, DNA has got this double strand. RNA here is shown as a single-stranded molecule. RNA can be double-stranded too, and actually it can fold up and base pair with itself and form weird 3D structures, but a lot of times it's a single-stranded chain. And so here we have an RNA molecule. It's peeling off of the DNA here. It's a copy of that DNA, and it's going out of the nucleus into the cytosol of the cell, into the cytoplasm, where it's going to meet with a special structure called the ribosome. And there's actually a lot of processing that happens in eukaryotes before the RNA leaves the nucleus of the cell. I'm going to skip over that here, but the message encoded in a message RNA is actually slightly different, or sometimes dramatically different than the message that's actually stored in the DNA. But the sequences in the RNA are the same, roughly the same as the sequences of the DNA, minus any modifications that happened after the RNA was produced. So it goes out into the cell, into the mouth of the ribosome, and the ribosome latches onto it. So here we zoomed in. You can see that the RNA molecule, the yellow molecule down here, has been attached to the ribosome, and the ribosome is building a protein now. And you can see that protein coming out of the top of the ribosome. This is a super simplified cartoon version of a ribosome. It's actually a really complicated structure. The ribosome is actually made out of RNA as well, mostly RNA. All of its functional bits are RNA based, which is really interesting because pretty much everything else in our body, the functional bits are protein. The ribosome's an exception to that. There's good reasons for that I'm not going to go into today, but it actually gave us some big clues as to the origin of life and the RNA world hypothesis. But the ribosome reads the messenger RNA. It reads this RNA chain 3 letters at a time, 3 nucleotides at a time. And it pulls amino acids out of its surrounding according to the message in the RNA. And it does that because of structures not drawn here, but I'm showing you a graph that someone else drew called transfer RNA. A transfer RNA is a piece of RNA that's folded up and stuck to itself. And on one end of it, on the tip here, this little yellow molecule here is an amino acid. That is serine. And serine is attached to this transfer RNA molecule. And down at the bottom here, this purple section of the transfer RNA molecule, that is 3 exposed nucleotides. And in this case, it is UCG. Those are the nucleotides that are exposed. Well, the ribosome, inside the ribosome, that UCG is base pairing. It's attracted to ACG in the RNA sequence. They're attracted to each other like a magnet inside the ribosome. It only works inside the ribosome. So when the ribosome is clamped on to an RNA chain, all of the transfer RNAs, which are just floating around in the water around the ribosome, they have their amino acids attached to them. They are attracted like a magnet to the ribosome when the ribosome is holding their specific 3-letter chunk of the messenger RNA. This is all mechanical. They are attracted to and they bring the amino acid, and there are 20 different types of transfer RNA. Actually, I think there are more. There are more. But each type of transfer RNA only attaches to a specific type of amino acid. And it's this that actually determines the rules of the genetic code that we're going to learn here. So it's the structure of the transfer RNAs that govern the rules of the genetic code. Because they're the ones that have that sequence on their tip, and they're the ones that are going to be selectively attracted to specific chunks of RNA. So here is the table, the cheat sheet for the genetic code. So here we have the codons. So every 3 letters in the genetic code. In a message RNA, every 3 letters in it is what we call a codon, and it codes for a specific amino acid. And it codes for that by attracting the appropriate transfer RNA when attached to the ribosome. So it's a very sophisticated system. Again, everything here is mechanical. And I want to point out that English is also mechanical. You have a thought in your head. You've got a word you want to say. Apple. You think of an apple, you want to say it, you want to communicate it. That thought is electrochemical. It's in your brain. It's physically transmitted, and we don't understand all the details of it in the case of the brain, but that's physically transmitted to your voice box and your mouth, and your voice box and your mouth and your lungs physically produce sound vibrations. Those sound vibrations are physically transmitted through the air to the ear of the receiver. The eardrum is physically moved by those sound vibrations. That causes a chemical electrical chain reaction, again, all physical, that produces the thought in the receiver's mind. So I've heard some people say that the genetic code doesn't really count as a genetic code because it's a physical process. All communication systems are physical processes, all of them. Like that's like all there is, really. So here is the flow of coded genetic information inside the cell. So the information is stored in DNA. It is modified and then transmitted via messenger RNA. That is received by the ribosome, and the ribosome uses that to build a protein. So information is stored in DNA, modified, then transmitted via RNA. That message tells the ribosome how to build a specific protein. Your genome communicates with the ribosome using the genetic code. Your keyboard communicates with the computer using the ASCII binary code. It's the same. It's all the same. Here we have, again, that chart. Here I'm showing you codons in a messenger RNA. CUG is the first codon that I have displayed here. And we can look at our chart here and we can find out what is it that CUG codes for. What amino acid does CUG code for inside the ribosome? Well, we can look that up. We can find CUG right here. It codes for leucine. Leucine is the protein that codes for, or sorry, the amino acid that codes for. So CUG tells the ribosome to grab a leucine from its environment and add it to the growing protein chain. UCU tells the ribosome to grab a, UCU, a serine, and add that to the protein chain. Here we have our cheat sheet here. And then GCA, I'm going to go down here. GCA tells the ribosome to grab an alanine amino acid. So those are all just different types of amino acids, and add that to the protein chain. This is the genetic code. It was cracked. Scientists cracked the code. By the way, let me just say, this is the standard genetic code. We talked earlier that some different organisms use a slightly tweaked version of this. This is the standard genetic code, and the standard genetic code was cracked in the 60s by scientists, a whole team of them. But Dr. Khorana is credited for having led that process. And he and his team won the Nobel Prize in 1968 for cracking this code. And again, they cracked a code, a real code. So just to summarize things, especially because, I think a lot of people came here late. So a code is a set of rules governing a communication system. These are all different examples of codes here. English is a language. It's a special type of code that linguists like to study, but it really is a code. It's a type of code. And there's the genetic code. So, yeah, questions. Oh, Jay asks, but why 3? Sorry, my voice is waning. Why 3? Is there a good reason why it's not 4 or 5, or did it just happen to evolve that way? It actually is a really good reason. So, earlier I said that codes can be arbitrary. Well, codes can be arbitrary, but they're usually, if it's a good code, it's optimized. So the words that we use most commonly in English are usually fairly short, and they're fairly easy to decipher from each other because English is a pretty good code. It's a fairly optimized code. Same is true for like Morse code. Actually, let me pull up Morse code again. In Morse code, if you look at E is just one dot, and they designed Morse code that way on purpose. E is the letter that's most commonly used in English, and so they made it the shortest, so it's easiest to transmit, so people don't have to spend a bunch of time typing. Notice that T is also really short. So good codes are optimized. Good codes are. The genetic code, it so happens, is also optimized. 3 happens to be the best. It happens to be the shortest amount of nucleotides that could code for 20 amino acids. So that's why. Now, of course, there is some redundancy in the genetic code. There's multiple ways to code for a single type of amino acid. If you look down here at alanine, for example, alanine is the amino acid that's coded for by all 4 of these codons. So there is redundancy, but that redundancy, it turns out, is also helpful because the ribosome has issues doing certain things, and having redundancy helps it not fail to read the message properly. So that redundancy is actually not wasted space. Okay, reading more questions here. I'm sorry, I'm reading. I should probably at least mutter to myself so you don't think that the connection's cut off. Uh, someone says no matter which language, it only makes sense to the I think there's a typo here. It only makes sense. Sorry, I'm trying to read what you wrote here, but it's a little bit discombobulated. In advance, um, existing language convention. Okay, so I think that what you're saying is that languages only really make sense. Languages can only work if the rules are agreed upon in advance. That is true for a language that is um, is already up and running. But languages, of course, develop, right? The first, so I'm an identical twin. I have a twin brother, and he and I invented our own language when we were kids. And we didn't have rules agreed upon in advance. We actually made the rules up as we went along. The only word that I remember from our language is gagak, which means candy. And if you think about how it is that we invented this language, I mean, I wish I would have filmed the whole thing. I wasn't smart enough to do that at the time, so that I could actually study it now. I'm sure someone studied how this works, but how I imagine that happened is babies are constantly babbling. We're constantly sending out noise, right? And sometimes, my brother would be sending out noise and we'd both be looking at the same thing. And so I would associate that noise with that thing. And then I'd start making that same noise when we were both looking at that same thing. And so we would develop a language together that way. So any two entities that can think and want to cooperate with each other can develop a language. The rules do not have to exist in agreement. And also, any two entities capable of evolution, descent with modification, acted upon by selection, any two entities capable of that can also develop a language. They can develop a set of rules through the process of evolution if the environment is favoring cooperation. The inventions of languages, the inventions of communication systems, it is an inevitable byproduct of cooperation. You cannot get the evolution of symbiosis, true cooperation between two organisms, without simultaneously evolving a communication system. These happen at the same time. It's one and the same. Yeah, so you're saying that ones and zeros aren't making a sense at all without a code, language convention that had defined the purpose. Yeah, you're right. But again, languages start out as noise. Well, I mean, in the case of binary code, that was just invented by somebody. But in nature, languages start out as noise. One entity develops the ability to read a pattern in that noise, and eventually you have both entities that are communicating to each other. So codes develop. The purpose, you could say, develops, if you want to call it a purpose. Let's see. Jay says, I have twin students that basically have their own form of communication, but it's more based on facial expressions. They can look at each other and then say the same things. It's really strange. Yeah. It's, my brother and I weren't, uh, all through kind of middle school and high school, we became more competitive with each other than cooperating all the time. So we actually didn't develop much of that that a lot of twins do. But I had neighbors. Now we're really good friends, but we were pretty competitive throughout high school. But now I had some neighbors a while back when I was living in Tennessee that were twins, and yeah, they finish each other's sentences, and it's really funny. Um, any more questions here? Was this clear? I keep seeing this is like a new thing within the atheist community online is to say that the genetic code is not code. It's something that I keep hearing over and over and over again, and it's just false. Like the genetic code is a code, just like binary code is a code, just like English is a code, just um, like it fits the definition of code according to Claude Shannon's communication theory. And it's Claude Shannon's communication theory that gave rise to the digital revolution. The genetic code is a code. So okay, something to point out here is that uh, a codon is not an amino acid, right? It just summons an amino acid according to the rules of the genetic code. So uh, it is a true symbol, even though a codon really is three molecules stuck together. They act as a symbol, an abstract symbol, you could say, summoning a particular amino acid. They represent an amino acid, and that's what we see in codes. Um, a letter is a representation of a phonetic sound that you can say with your mouth. An S is S, and so on. Jay says, I think a lot of people get confused and think that DNA itself is what is described as the code, but DNA is a storage mechanism. The code itself is the codon chart. Yes, that is correct. But this is actually a confusion not just in genetics. This has to do with kind of the language that's evolved within computer programming. A lot of times, if I'm not a programmer, I did a little bit of programming in PHP, but I was a coder. I was an HTML coder for a while. I did web design in high school and stuff. And a lot of times I'd write my HTML. HTML is markup code. And I'd say, hey, check out my code. Will you go over my code here real quick? What I should, if I wanted to be accurate with my words, I'd say, hey, look at the message that I wrote in HTML code. Would you examine that for me real quick? So when people say that DNA is code, they're using that slightly wrong. They're using it in the same way that a coder would say, hey, will you look at my code that I wrote? Uh, that's common, and that is technically an error, but it's just kind of how people talk about things now. And again, a tiny percentage of our DNA actually uses the genetic code. Most of our DNA is, people used to call it junk DNA, but it's actually used for stuff. It's not completely junk, but it doesn't code for protein, most of it. And a lot of it is involved in higher communication systems. So communication systems inside the nucleus that are determining what types of genes should be sent out to the ribosome. A lot of the so-called junk DNA is actually used in those higher communication systems. Again, life is communication system on top of communication system on top of communication system. And communication systems evolve every time an evolving entity is under selection pressure to cooperate. Yeah, someone says, I often hear that DNA is not a language, Sebastian says, but that is something different from code, I would argue. Yeah, so code and language are interchangeable. A linguist that studies human languages would be mad at me for saying that, because linguists define language specifically as a code that's used between two humans to talk to each other. But, and if you talk to a programmer, they'll talk about PHP being a coding language. They'll talk about Java being a coding language. So these two words are kind of interchangeable. English is a code. It's also a language. It's a natural language, specifically. Yeah. Someone says, the only reason that I'll say that I don't think genetics is a code is that people misunderstand what that phrasing implies, like someone in chat, for instance. Yeah. Yeah, there's someone here that needs to rewatch this a few times. The uh so that's kind of an argument for teaching, like, because people misunderstand what code is, should we not call the genetic code a code? That's an argument that some people make. And that's an argument that I am willing to have and listen to, but the genetic code is a code. And my stance right now is that, you know, if someone's confused about it, we should just teach them what it is instead of change the name, because, the people who discovered it called it the genetic code. It was a big deal. Um, they got the Nobel Prize for it, and it is a code. And so let's just call it that. The confusion is that, of course, codes, most of the codes that we think of, like Morse code and binary code, they were invented kind of at one sitting by some person and then taught to everybody else. And the genetic code, like all natural codes and languages, emerged. It evolved over time. Well, honestly, we don't know the origin of the genetic code in details, but we do know the origin of many codes, and the codes that we find in nature, they evolve over time. And so we can be very confident that the genetic code also evolved over time. And there's actually several different models for the origin of the genetic code. Again, none of them are fully agreed upon. We have so little data about what happened back then. This was very, very early on at the origin of life. There are some organisms, though, things we would call organisms, that do not use the genetic code at all. There are these things called viroids. Some people don't like to call viruses and viroids organisms. I do. But there are viroids that do not use the genetic code at all. They do not code for proteins at all. Instead, they infect cells and eat their essentially eat their nucleotides. They use a RNA replicase to make copies of themselves. So they use the cell's protein. They don't code for any protein on their own. They just use the cell's protein to make copies of themselves, and then they infect other cells. And so there are organisms that do not use the genetic code, but and we think that the early organisms, of course, did not use the genetic code either. The earliest organisms, the genetic code is a sophisticated communication system that would have taken a long time to evolve, and the earliest evolving critters would not have used it. Jay's talking about the movie Arrival. That's a good movie. Um, Zero 132132 says there's a case to be made for lies to children in a broad sense. Um, yeah, yeah. Someone asks, is it something worthwhile to argue about? Why is there objections to calling it a code if we understand the meaning? I think that most people that are arguing against it don't understand it. I think, a lot of people in the atheist community don't understand that the genetic code really is a code because they haven't studied information science. They haven't studied communication science. And that's why. So what they're doing is that there's a group of creationists that say the genetic code is a real code. Codes can only be invented by an intelligent being. Therefore, the genetic code was invented by an intelligent being. That's the argument that creationists are making. And they're wrong. There are all kinds of codes, all kinds of communication systems that evolve over time. You don't need someone to invent it. But I think what's happening is the people that don't like that argument, they don't like the conclusion of that argument. They know that the conclusion is wrong, but they don't know why, and so they attack the idea that the genetic code is a code instead of attacking the idea that codes have to be invented. So people are trying to teach evolution, but they're doing it wrong. They're trying to teach science, but they're doing it wrong. Oh, cool. So you said it's true. I didn't know anything about communication science until this stream. Well, hopefully this was helpful. Uh, I find it absolutely fascinating. Claude Shannon, I think, is the smartest person that I have ever, whose work I have ever read. People talk about Einstein being a genius, Tesla being a genius. Like, I really would put Claude Shannon up there, maybe even above those two. The guy is insane. If I could spend time in the mind of another person, spend like a year in the mind of another person, it would be him. He understood things in such an amazing way. Just to be able to look, I mean, if you look at all these different types of code, let me pull back. If you look at all these different types of code, it doesn't look like there's something in common with them. If you look at English versus Morse code versus binary code, like, it's not super obvious what's in common with them. He was able to tease that out and demonstrate it mathematically. Like the paper that I showed you, it's like something like 55 pages. Most of it's math. And I'm not a math person, but he's actually pretty good at describing what's going on there too between the equations. And so I was able to follow it. But yeah, it's really difficult. And actually, if you just look up the definition of code, you're going to find basically a list of codes. People, like, the dictionary doesn't define it properly. The definition that I have here, code is a set of rules governing a communication system. I pulled that from Claude Shannon's paper. I didn't pull it directly from it, though, because he never specifically says this. He just gives a bunch of examples and explains codes. So I was able to pull that definition out of his writings. And the Wikipedia article on code, if you just look up code on Wikipedia, has a definition very similar to this, which is funny because I wrote my definition independently of theirs, but just basing it off of his paper. And I think whoever wrote that article did the same. They read his paper and pulled the definition from it. But there's a lot of confusion in the public about what code is. So let's see. I think I'm going to wrap things up here unless there's another question. Thank you for all the people who did super chats. I really appreciate that. That's, another shout out to Jay. Big shout out to Jay and to 0132132. Let me just check for questions here. I'm reading. I promise I'm reading right now. I didn't get cut out here. Brant says, shoot, I wish I would have got here sooner. I still don't know anything about communication science. Well, you can just watch this after I hit publish. You can watch it from the start. By the way, if you're rewatching these, I recommend watching them on ×2 speed, which is the benefit of watching it later. You can't, be in the chat hanging out with me, but you can, watch it in high speed. YouTube has the option to watch things in normal speed or double speed. Okay. And what should cat mean in this context? Well, a cat is a mammal that meows. Uh, by the way, that's my twin brother there, Mike Perry. um, all right, I think I'm going to wrap it up. It looks like we've answered questions. I apologize if I have not. Let me give like 2 more minutes. If you do an at stated casually, I'll make sure to see it because it highlights it in orange for me, which is cool. But it looks like 2 times speed super chat. Thanks, Brant. Sorry, what were you about to ask, Jay? Zero says, "Hey, Mike Perry, one day I'm going to run into you at Chipotle or something and be like, holy cow, I love your YouTube channel." Yeah, that happens. People confuse Mike and I a lot. Um, uh, yeah, we have good times with that. Oh, if that was your twin, you confirmed it before I finished typing. Yeah. Yeah. Mike's my twin. Mike and I should do a podcast together because Mike is a Mormon and I am an atheist. And so we've thought about doing an evil twin podcast called The Evil Twin, which we should totally do. Um, I'm unfortunately about to move, so we won't be close to each other, but we could do it. We could do it over Google Hangouts. That'd be fun. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you for the super chats. This was a lot of fun. Like, I nerd out on this stuff. I love thinking about this. Again, like Claude Shannon, I think is just a genius. Figuring this stuff out was just one of many, many crazy things he figured out. He really is responsible for the digital revolution, in my opinion. My reading of history puts it on him. He's the reason we have a computer and YouTube. But so yeah, thank you for coming. And until next time, stay curious.